We're turning our attention now to some facts and figures, and Babajide Ogunsanwo, our data and information analyst, joins us this morning. Thank you for coming on today.
For me, it's always great to be here.
Well, yes, indeed. We'll be looking at states. What are they doing with, first, they've got their budgets. They have different aspects of the budget, capital and recurrent expenditure. Talking about the capital expenditure, you've been looking into that to see how does that affect anything in those states? What have you seen or connect with the capital expenditure of some of those states?
So there's several ways we could look at it. But we should also remember in 1981, that's over 3 decades ago, what Ronald Reagan had said, that government isn't the solution to our problems. Government is the problem.
Whoa.
Government is the problem. And so today we feel, and the question on the lips of almost every Nigerian is, can the government assist us to get out of recession? Well, let's look at what the arithmetic shows. Today, the most used measure to measure the size of the economy, even though it's not the most accurate, is the GDP, the gross domestic product. The evidence shows that the private sector, you and I, still accounts for 78% of the size of the economy, whereby the government only accounts for 7%. Corporate investments and net exports accounts for the balance of 15%. So the evidence does show that if we were to run out of recession, it should be led by the private sector, the private households, and really not the government. So when the government does attempt, the 7% tries to determine what will happen to the 93%, then it does feel like political talk. But should they then drop all this effort? No, this doesn't mean that they should drop all the effort. This just means that the faster way out of all of this is to energize the private sector, to look at the distribution of wealth, the distribution of income, not necessarily how the economy grows. You remember the case of the United States, 2008 to 2009, when they were also facing similar economic challenges. The evidence showed that even though the economy was back on track, only 1% of income earners, 1% of income earners accounted for 93% of the growth. In states today, we have a 6.6 trillion naira budget.
Across the states?
Across all the states, 6.6 trillion naira. Most of this still goes on to recurrent.
Wow.
But the challenge is, looking at it from the state perspective doesn't tell the entire picture. The entire picture shows that there are some states and indeed some regions that are the heavyweights. Let's look at Lagos, 813 billion naira for its budget. The budget of Lagos State, Chamberlain, is more than the budget of all those 6 states in the North Central combined together. The budget of Lagos State is more than all the states in the Northeast, more than all the 5 states even in the Southeast. So there's a challenge into where do investors want to put their money. And if we have all this kind of information, it clearly lets you know that even when capital comes into the country, capital will follow where the government has also placed its money. And so let's look at the first thing, how capital has flowed into the country over the last 3 to 4 years.
Okay.
Let's look at it quarter on quarter. The evidence today shows that in the first quarter of this year, total capital inflow less than $1 billion. In 2014, it was significantly more than that. The narrative is that capital flow is nowhere near its historic levels. Even though if we look at the first quarter of this year compared to the first quarter of this year compared to the first quarter of last year, we see an improvement in capital flows. But however, we are nowhere near historic levels. Let's look at it in another way. In 2014, total capital flows into the country, $20.7 billion. 2014, 3 years after, first quarter of this year, less than $1 billion. So the question is, why isn't the money coming in? Why isn't the money coming in? But before we can ask or answer that question of why isn't the money coming in, we need to ask another question, and why was all of this money coming into the country? And it was because foreign investors are taking a short-term position on the Nigerian economy. A lot of that money was going into the stock exchange, shares. Short-term investments were going into...
So they were like portfolio investors?
They were portfolio investors, taking short-term positions. However, it then shows, moving into the second thing, that portfolio investors are no longer interested in the economy because they clearly can't see the short-term opportunities. And so, if we look at total flows coming into the country, we've seen a significant reduction in portfolio investments, but we've seen an increase in foreign direct investments. So we've seen that move from 13% in the first quarter of 2014 to 23%.
So is this a good development that we're seeing less of portfolio investors?
It's a good development on one hand, because we then see that most of the money coming in is stable money.